Our first speaker is Professor Walter Ameling of the University of Cologne. Walter Ameling took his PhD on Herodotus Atticus in 1982 in Cologne. He wrote it under the supervision of Reinhold Merkelbach, a mythological classical scholar. And he defended his habilitation on Carthago in 1991 at Universität Würzburg. Both were published as books. Between 1996 and 2009, he was full professor in ancient history at Friedrich Schiller Universität, Jena. And between 2009 and 2024, Alfred Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach, professor of ancient history at the University of Cologne. He was twice member of the Institute of Advanced Study, Princeton, in 2001, which resulted in Inscriptiones Judaicae Orientis II, Kleinasien, which was published in 2004. And the second term, the one during which I believe we met for the first time, in 2006-2007, which led to a series of articles on Christian martyrs. Since 2009, he is a co-editor of Corpus Inscriptionum Iudaeae Palestinae. Today, he will speak on coexistence and interaction of ethnic groups in Alexandria. Professor Rabbi, please.
Mr. President, dear Professor Harel, Mrs. Chair, dear Professor Finkelberg, and of course, dear Ben, many congratulations to your 80th birthday. May we all meet as well and as healthy in a decade to celebrate your 90th birthday, here or elsewhere. I am, of course, highly honored to be here, the only speaker, as was sometimes said, not affiliated with the university of this country. However, I firmly believe that this honor does not go to me personally, but to one of the central scientific undertakings of the last 20 years in Professor Isaac's rich and varied career. I represent the editors of the Corpus Inscriptionum Iudaeae Palestinae, for which he has contributed so much materially and intellectually. We, as editors, are again profoundly grateful for his part in our common work, and I believe that this is a work that is not only an important scholarly undertaking, but also an undertaking that is important to this country, making it easier to bring centuries of its history in focus. I hesitated for some time if it wouldn't be more appropriate to give a lecture in honor of Professor Isaac that is related to the work on our epigraphic corpus. But thankfully, his work is multifaceted, and what I'm going to present has at least connections with one of his major books, The Invention of Racism in Classical Antiquity. And racism in this book does not only apply to anti-Semitism, but also to other forms of racism. For instance, the Greek and Roman stance against barbarians or Egyptians. Alexandria, to tell the truth, has only one entry in the general index, but perhaps this does not matter for today, especially since we have in this book a long chapter on attitudes towards Egyptians, on attitudes towards Jews. Coexistence and interactions of ethnic groups in Alexandria. This title demands at least some explanation and definitions. We know more about Alexandria than about any other ancient city, with the exception of Rome and Athens, and we imagine a melting pot where not only Greek, Egyptian, and Hebrew could be heard at the festivals, but where arts and lifestyle tended to enforce the dominance of one culture, of Greek culture, to the loss of one's own. See the poems by Cavafy. This image can be enriched by Alexandrian scholarship, medicine, literature, but it is biased. Our sources are full of violence and full of disdain of the other. To quote just one example from the middle of the 1st century BCE, when one of the Romans killed a cat and the multitude rushed in a crowd to his house, neither the officials sent by the king to back the man off, nor the fear of Rome were enough to save him from punishment. Coexistence and interaction are not necessarily peaceful. Different religious attitudes, different ethnic groups, the inability of the government to preserve inner peace are the hallmarks of this and other excesses that were brought about by coexistence. Ethnic groups exist because they perceive themselves as such and/or because others share this perception. Contemporaries of the Ptolemies and the Roman emperors will have had no difficulty to find people from every known country, and some more in Alexandria. But if we want to talk of ethnic groups, we are restricted to just a few of them: Greeks, perhaps Macedonians, Egyptians, Jews, and in later times, Christians, who sometimes understood themselves as a specific race, a third race. But these ethnic groups did not exist in a vacuum. Everybody is defined by multiple allegiances, by multiple identities. I resist the example to use our gathering as an example, but we all can be defined by our family relations, by religion, by membership, by professional organizations, by membership in cultural groups, by living in a certain quarter, and so on. People of Alexandria were multifaceted too, and it is easily understood that not only the ethnic group, but also the social or legal status defined a person, depending on his different endeavors. Ethnic, social, and legal status are entwined and might depend on each other. Lastly, I'm afraid that we historians do not live in the best of imaginable worlds. We do not know enough about ethnic groups and their interactions because, as usual, sources to many of our questions are lacking. We know much more about the intellectual than about the social or economic identities of most of these groups. Think only about the Jewish people of Alexandria, where part of the Septuagint was translated where Philo wrote. This is, of course, proof of intellectual interaction with the Greeks, for instance, with their language, their philosophy, their scholars. But again, what part of the Septuagint is typical of the Alexandrian community? This is a question that's difficult to answer. If we do not take everything written in Egypt as Alexandrian, and perhaps we should not do so because Alexandria was Alexandria ad Aegyptum, and there are a number of easily determined differences between Alexandria and Egypt. The Ptolemies did not institute a new and unifying code of law for Egypt, but a Greek city had such a code, and the social relations were regulated by the constitution of the polis, even if the kings might interfere. Privately, one might use the Hebrew or Egyptian language, see the poems, but publicly only Greek was used. The decrees of the polis are a good example. The gods were the gods of the polis, and none of the Egyptian gods was venerated by the polis. Over time, the Rabis, in the form worshipped in Alexandria, was accepted as their god by the Egyptians. A temple for Isis came very late. The Ptolemies did not build or establish Egyptian temples in Alexandria, and since there were no old temples in place, a strong indigenous priesthood was lacking. There was no expert and learned class steeped in Egyptian traditions. Cassius Dio was not completely wrong when he spoke of Alexandrians and Egyptians, Alexandreis te kai Aegyptioi. The latter, the Egyptians, meaning the people of the province at large. And it is much easier, of course, easier for me to start with legal than with social conditions. When Alexander laid the foundations of his city, he wanted to establish a polis, a community of citizens, of people with civic rights. The polis is a Greek concept. The new citizens were Greeks and Macedonians, and everybody else was an inhabitant of the city. But there was more work to be done in Alexandria than those new settlers could accomplish. Walter Scheidel made it very probable that quotation, generally everybody who lived within a 30-mile radius from the site was expected to, or rather forced to, resettle. From the beginning, Egyptians provided the largest number of residents in Alexandria, but Greeks and Macedonians were established as a civic elite, and everybody else was excluded from this status. Even so, some non-Alexandrians, especially members of the royal entourage, could exercise more powers than citizens could. A city like Alexandria needed a constant influx of people to keep its population on the same level. Most of the newcomers came from the Ptolemaic possessions, but the most populous of these possessions was Egypt. Most immigrants came from Egypt, and if the internal migration to the Egyptian metropolis, the capitals of the nomes in Roman times, is anything to go by, mostly men migrated from their point of living to one of the cities. The metropolis had a large surplus of men, roughly 130 men on 100 women. It is for you to decide if this made for a more aggressive atmosphere, but it certainly established the simple fact that Egyptian workers were always the numerical majority in Alexandria. Their sheer number makes it difficult to accept the idea that the Egyptians lived in ethnic colonies, a term used for formal and informal structures of ethnic self-organization of migrants. And only a minority, roughly 10 to 15% of Alexandria's population, consisted of citizens, and nothing tells us that it got easy to become a citizen. Instead, something else happened. Since many Greek residents had no citizenship to hand down to their children, they did not feel too compelled to marry other citizens. Intermarriage between Greeks and Egyptians was not uncommon. This group, of course, suffered from legal subordination from which no constitution could protect them, and one might ask if part of its reputation as being quarrelsome, irritable, and difficult to control did not start from here. When the historian Polybius wrote about his visit to Alexandria between 145 and 116, he found no citizens of any import. Characterizing the population, he wrote that 3 groups lived in the city: the Egyptian or indigenous tribe, who were irritable and litigious, and the mercenaries, who were violent, numerous, and dissolute. By an ancient custom, they maintained foreign men and arms, taught by the worthlessness of the kings to rule rather than be ruled. Thirdly, the group of the Alexandrians, who had, for some reasons, no pronounced sense of living in a community, were not favorable toward politics, but were nevertheless better than the 2 others. Even so, they were mixed. They were Hellenists by origin and remembered the common Hellenic customs. The Egyptians, of course, were to be expected. The soldiers as a group seemed to be confirmed by dedication to Zeus Soter and Hera Teleia, dated either to 112 or to 76. That means possibly only a few years after Polybius wrote those words we just heard. The dedicator was a community, the Polytoma, of soldiers enrolled in Alexandria. And the third group, the Alexandrians, is a bit difficult to assess. Our first inclination is to understand them as the citizens of Alexandria. But this has to be wrong, since Polybius' categories here are moral, not legal. Polybius' judgment on the Alexandrians is harsh. That they had at least a connection with to politikon has a reason. They were Hellenists by origin and remembered the common Hellenic customs. Polybius understood evidently that the Alexandrians were an ethnic group. Even so, they did not come out of a single city, but out of many cities and perhaps tribes. This argument excludes the possibility that Hellenes is here used as a legal category covering the members of many nations, a tax category in Ptolemaic Egypt. Their common descent, their consciousness of common descent are important for Polybius' definition. Of course, there are other nations present in Alexandria, but let us just note that roughly 2 generations after the Ptolemy had lost Caesarea, Polybius does not mention Jews as an important part of the Alexandrian population. They will have been present, but were not a feature of the city's population, numerous enough to be noticed by this eyewitness. Polybius couples his moral standards, with his ideas of ethnicity. Political status, for instance, citizenship, does not really interest him here. He evidently believes that each people had, according to their descent, their own characteristics. Certainly not new. And with Polybius at the latest starts a long row of derogatory remarks about the population of Alexandria. And after having read Polybius, nobody will be surprised if the remarks about the Greek polis Alexandria are very much like the ones about the Egyptians at large. But things, of course, as I mentioned before, were not always that simple. There's a text category, Hellenes, which was used without recourse to ethnic origin. Hellenes, Greeks, denoted the superior text status, and what, or if there were linguistic or cultural requirements, is not clear. This text category disappeared with the Romans, who had a much simpler system to classify the population. They had roughly the following categories: Roman citizens, citizens of the Greek polis, among them Alexandria, and the rest of the population, Egyptians. Again, Egyptians not as an ethnic, but used for everybody who did not belong to the first categories. The Romans and the citizens of Alexandria were specially privileged, since they did not need to pay the poll tax, which the non-citizens, the vast majority of Alexandria inhabitants, had to pay. Those who had been Hellenes, at least in tax matters, had become Egyptians. This may have been a blow to somebody who felt his status diminished and who did not belong anymore to the privileged, cultured group of the Greeks. It was certainly a blow for the Jewish community too, and this should contradict every modern idea that the Romans somehow privileged the Jews for services rendered during the late Republic. The question of status occupies most of the interactions of our different groups of Jews, Egyptians, Greeks. The topic has not really been discussed for Egyptians, evidently because there is not much to discuss. They may have had rights of residence, nobody hindered them to practice their religion, but they did not participate in the running of the city. Even so, some of them may have reached Alexandrian citizenship. The question has been discussed at large for the Jews, for whom an unlucky passage in Strabo seemed to have shown that they were to a certain degree autonomous. This interpretation was combined with the idea that the Alexandrian Jews formed a corporate body, a politeuma. Such corporate bodies, politeumata, had been licensed by the Ptolemies for groups of foreign soldiers and may have had semi-autonomous organization. You remember the politeumaton stratioton. As far as I can tell, all this vanished with time and with the Ptolemies, and the only attestations of politeumata in Roman Alexandria that I have found are these two inscriptions, and it is quite clear that these two inscriptions show us something, a group of people of common descent and perhaps of common religion. Perhaps also, second inscription, a common burial site. Any political function of politeumata, if they had such a function in Ptolemaic times, stopped with the Romans. Of course, right of residence, right to pursue their religion remained a given for the Jews. They were on the same level as everybody else in Rome, Alexandria. And again, there can have been and will have been people of different personal status in the Jewish communities with Alexandrian citizenship, even with Roman citizenship. But this did not confer status to the Jewish community at large. So certainly the connections and the social status of these people were used. Philo was not the head of the Jewish embassy to the Emperor Gaius because he was a famous philosopher, but because he belonged to a family with Roman citizenship. His counterpart, the head of the Alexandrian embassy, was Apion, by then Tiberius Claudius Apion, citizen of Alexandria, a citizen of Rome, both honors conferred on him because of his spectacular successes in the Greek games. He had been the first man to be twice victor in verse in the Periodos, and was the first of the poets to have entered in triumphal procession in a white four-horse chariot, whose statues could be seen at Actium, Olympia, Pytho, the Isthmus, and Nemea. He belonged to the second sophistic. He was a star, an intellectual star of the times. And the Alexandrian embassy to the Emperor Claudius contained 12 members, 6 of them Roman citizens, and the emperor is polite enough to call one of them my most honored Babilus. These examples show how important status was to reach political aims in Rome. And status had, of course, a similar impact if one wanted access to the prefect in Alexandria or to Roman officials in Egypt. Some of the men who intervened with the prefect against the Jewish community were men of immense influence in the city. In a new study, they were associated with the clubs, with the association and every kind of association in the city. Even so, these clubs are always seen as community building, because here people of different levels met, Roman citizens, Alexandrian citizens, normal Greeks, and perhaps also Egyptians, but presumably no Jews, because all the clubs centered around cults. Such associations, such clubs could have been a means to influence, to protection, to make one's voice heard. They gave access to patrons, but also to clients. They helped to solve disputes, bureaucratic or administrative difficulties. The leader of these associations had access not only to Egypt's prefect, but also to Rome. That is the contention. Sociologically, this may work. But how? Did the demands of the lower reaches got access to the Roman administration via the leaders of the clubs? Or did those leaders use their influence to incite the pagan population of the city against the Jews in 38? The argument for the latter case has been made, but I do not believe that it really works, because mob violence and civil war never endeared magistrates to the emperor. The argument ignores the fact, too, that there is a history of ethnic conflict between, especially, but not only, Egyptians and Jews. And both Philo and Josephus tell us that there was a long and bitter enmity of the Alexandrian people against the Jews. According to Philo, according to Josephus, questions of status were paramount in the origin of the pogrom of 38. Were the rights of the Jews similar to those of the citizens, superior to those of the Egyptians? Were they aspiring to something they had no right to? Did they aim at more than they have previously had, Claudius? And what was this more? Political status? If political status, why were the Egyptians interested in the exclusivity of Alexandrian citizenship? One important point was certainly the religious isolation of Jews in a polytheistic society, but ethnicity played its role too. Both parties tried to use ethnic stereotypes to disgrace the other. The Alexandrians tried to prove that the Jews were Egyptians, while the Jewish point of view was that they themselves belonged to the Greeks, whereas their enemies were Egyptians. For both parties considered Egyptians as the lowest possible status, both parties fought for their inclusion among the Greeks, with different definitions of what being Greek actually meant. We have another papyrus, perhaps not a political memorandum, but part of a historical romance. In this text, the restoration of a council, a boule, for Alexandria was demanded because such a council would take care that the pure citizen body of Alexandria is not corrupted by men who are uncultured and uneducated. Uncultured and uneducated. This is certainly a barb against ethnic minorities in Egypt, be they Egyptian or perhaps Jewish. This papyrus belongs to a group of semi-literary texts which are usually called the Acta Alexandrinorum, fancifully translated as the Acts of the Pagan Martyrs, with the Alexandrian martyrs. The main characters are historical persons, even persons known to us from Philo's account of 38. The most important dialogic parts concern trials of members of the Alexandrian upper class before Roman authorities, trials in which the Alexandrians hurl insult against the Romans, mostly accusing them of Philo-Semitism. The emperors concerned range from Claudius to Commodus. The gymnasiarch Isidoros, well known as one of the villains in Philo's In Flacum, accuses the emperor and is condemned to death. This is, of course, all literature, not history, but it can be used to show what one or more authors in Alexandria thought about the way people and groups related to each other. These acts contend that the emperors favored the Jews, who were only troublemakers and agitators. They are again called Egyptians. At the same time, the Greekness of the counterparts is stressed, a Greekness that is seen as endangered by Rome, and the emperors who did not accept the general superiority of the Greeks. Evidently, in the Acts, both the stance against the emperor and the stance against the Jews are necessary to survive and to be recognized as Greek. And one might wonder whether this, as was suggested, is the attempt to distance themselves from the Polybian characterization as a mixed group, clearly less than Greeks, or if it is only a consequence of the intellectual currents of the day that emphasize Greekness. On the other hand, the Jewish parts of the Oracula Sibyllina prophesize the misery of Greece and, again, disgrace of the Egyptians. Is this only literature? Did this literature have any practical implication? Can we use this as reflex of existing conditions, as we tend to do? I leave it to you to decide.